All right, so it's an honor to be with all of you this morning, and what we're going to do is we are going to set off on a challenge, and our challenge is going to be to explore communication and to ask the question, how does communication affect our lives? Now, here is why this challenge is difficult, because communication is a super broad discipline and a topic, and we only have 45 minutes, so let's go ahead and launch right into our topic. So here is what we're going to do this morning. We're going to look at three things. Take a look at the screen. The first question we're going to ask is, why is communication critical? In other words, why should I not turn to my iPad over the next 45 minutes just to kind of surf and play a little Tetris, right? In other words, why is communication critical? Second question we're going to deal with is, why do we often communicate so poorly? And, of course, we'll finish off on a positive note, and that is, what can we do to communicate better? What can we do to communicate better? So let's launch into our first question. Why is communication important? Why is communication critical? I'd like you to take a look at the screen. I'm going to show you one of my favorite commercials of all time. Listen carefully. Favorite commercial of all time. Why is communication important? Let's roll the sound.
Das hier ist mein Sektor.
Das hier ist das wichtigste Gerät des Küstenwächters. Das Gerät und das Gerät.
Überlebensradar.
Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you... Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
We can play that one again later if you'd like. So, why is communication critical? Number one reason why it is critical, it helps us to understand and to process the world around us. So good communication gives us a set of tools in our tool belt so that we can process and understand the world around us. And if we've got poor communication skills, a la our wonderful German recruit, then the world makes less sense. So it is critical for us to have great communication skills so that we can process and understand the world around us a little bit better. Number two, number one, it's how we process the world. Number two is how we interact with each other. Communication is not optional because communication is the only way that you and I actually develop relationships with each other. It's the way that we interact with each other in the world in which we live. One author actually calls communication the lifeblood of relationships. Let that one sink in for just a moment. Communication is the lifeblood of relationships. Another way to think about it is communication is like a highway infrastructure. And if you have a city with a lot of people living in it, but no way for the people to get from point A to point B in an effective way, you have what? Traffic, right? So communication is the lifeblood of relationships. Communication is the way that you and I, the only way that you and I interact together. And for this reason, communication happens to be one of the top reasons that marriages end in divorce. I think we've heard some of this already, not only this morning, but throughout the days before. I want to show you the top three reasons that marriages end in divorce. Number one, infidelity. Number two, communication breakdown. And number three, abuse. There are lots more reasons, but those are the ones that have made their way to the top of the list. Communication breakdown, right? Now take a look. Actually, according to the American Counseling Association, what does the American Counseling Association say? The most common thread throughout all broken marriages is the breakdown in communication. Now then, remember, we're talking about all of these topics at various levels. Number one, we're talking about them at the family level. Number two, we're talking about them at the organizational level, right? In our context, we're talking about them at the level of the local church, at the level of our family as a conference here in Texas. And so what we find is that communication and the breakdown of communication is not only important in the family unit, but take a look at what corporate America is saying. Take a look at that first one there. A study of 480 companies, recent study, found that employers ranked communication abilities first. What was that number? First. That 480 companies ranked communication first among the desirable personal qualities of future employees. Take a look at the second survey, a survey of recruiters from Fortune 500 companies, companies there that have over 50,000 employees. So these are mega companies. And here's what they were asked: what about hiring managers or promoting people to management positions? What do you look for? And here's what they said: communication skills were cited as the single most decisive factor in choosing managers from the mega companies around the world. So communication is critical because it is the way that we interact with each other. It's the way that we build relationships with each other. It is so important that most marriages end because communication breaks down, and it is so important that if you work and you hope one of these days to actually move up in the ranks of whatever you're trying to do, know that your managers and your supervisors are looking at what? Communication skills. How do you relate to the people around you? Do you know what tact is? Do you know how to use words wisely and carefully? So that is the second reason that we are looking at communication this morning. Number 3, take a look. So first, why is communication critical? It's how we process the world. It's how we understand the world. Number 2, it's how we interact. And it's number 3, we are always communicating no matter what we're doing. Some of you, may be thinking, well, this is great, but it's not, really for me. The fact is that no matter what we are doing, we are always communicating something. Think about this. When you decide to lay down on your bed, you're communicating something, right? You're communicating, I'm exhausted. Or you're communicating, I'm relaxed. You're communicating something to the person seeing you lay on your bed. If you're walking your dog in the morning, it's not just a person walking a dog. That person is communicating something. Number 1, I'm an animal lover. I love animals, and I love them enough to make sure that every morning my dog gets a walk, right? Or you may be communicating that even though my dog has an enormous backyard, I'm taking my dog for a walk because I enjoy participating in my community. I enjoy watching my neighbors, mow their lawn and saying hi to them. You are communicating something when you're walking your dog. Think about this, for example. When you walk into the room and you still have your headsets on, or when you walk into a meeting, you still have your giant Bluetooth on, you're communicating something. Subtly, you are communicating, I am not available. Right? No matter if you're on a conference call and you walk into the convenience store to pay for your gas or to buy a Snickers bar, and you go on and you've got your headsets on, and you are communicating, I'm not available. So whatever we're doing, it doesn't matter. Begin going through a list of things in your mind, and you will find that you're not going to come up with any single one thing that you and I can do that doesn't somehow communicate something. That's why communication is so absolutely critical. The question is this: are we aware of what we are communicating? Are we aware of what we're communicating, even in the way that we sit in our chair right now at this very moment? And are we aware of what effect that is having? In other words, whatever we're doing, are we aware of the effect that that's having on the people around us? That's why communication is so absolutely critical. Number 4, and this is the last one here, because when we can't communicate, or in other words, when we have poor communication skills, that leads to a deep sense of frustration. I mean, think about communication at a very, very shallow level in terms of just human language. Think about how you felt, or maybe even how you feel, being in an environment where your primary language is not the primary language of most of the people around you. How do you feel? To some degree, you feel frustrated because you can't express yourself. Right, so that is at the shallow level of just simple language. But think about all of the things that are deep down inside your soul, the core of who makes up you as a person and trying to express those things. If you don't have good communication skills, if I have poor communication skills, I will be frustrated if I can't express those things about me in a marriage relationship, to my children, to my boss, to my church members. Poor communication skills leads to a deep sense of frustration. I'll give you a story. I want you to meet Emily. Emily Gossio. Emily was a young, budding art student. And one day on the way to class, she was riding her bike and she was hit by an 18-wheeler. Hit by a semi-truck. In one instant, Emily's life was completely changed forever. That accident had a number of different effects on her mind and on her body. Number one, it caused a stroke. Number two, it caused cardiac arrest, traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures of her head, multiple fractures of her body, and it left her blind, deaf, and completely unable to communicate. Months and months she spent in ICU at the hospital, and there was absolutely no getting better. In other words, there were no signs that she was improving. In fact, she was getting worse because she was angry. Nothing that they would try to do for her was received by her. She would reject everything, including they made earpieces for her so that she could have hearing aids that would restore part of her hearing. She would not have those hearing aids in her ears at all. And she bucked and she screamed and she did everything to resist all the help that was trying to be given to her because she could not communicate anymore with the world around her. Can you imagine in 1 second going from what she was to that? And it's very hard to see the picture, but. And the doctors came in and said, we have no hope for her, and so we're suggesting that you place Emily in a long-term nursing facility. And her family finally made the decision, let's go forward and move Emily into a long-term care facility because there's nothing we can do for her. There was only one person who said, absolutely not. Over my dead body, will you move her into a place where she's just going to be the same for the next who knows how many years? And that was her boyfriend. Her boyfriend had stayed by her side the entire time, and he was refusing to go along with the family's plan. In his mind, he started thinking, is there a way that I could break through? Is there a way that I can make the connection with Emily? Is there any way at all? And at 2 o'clock in the morning, something dawned on him. Helen Keller. And he remembered that with Helen Keller, it took a very interesting form of communication. It took writing in Helen's hand for her to be able to understand concepts and words and so on and so forth. And so he tried it. He went over to her and grabbed her hand and signed in her hand, I love you. That had an instant result. Instantly, Emily said, oh, that's so sweet, the way that she could talk. Those were the first words that she had uttered to that point in that ICU. And he had found a eureka moment. From that point on, he started signing into her hand, and they had back and forth conversation. And lo and behold, Emily started getting better and better and better and better. Emily today is not in a long-term nursing facility. Emily is back in art school. She is still blind from the accident. But she is back in art school in New York City, happy and healthy, and that on the left is a picture of her as you see her today. Her story was so inspirational that NPR took it and distributed far and wide via their very popular radio program called The Radio Lab. Emily's story is important for a very, very important reason, because it tells us about the power and necessity of communication, and her story is symbolic of how fundamental communication is to our existence, and perhaps we should say to the quality of our existence. So then, if communication is so central to who we are, if communication is such a core element of who we are as individuals, as families, as married couples, as local churches, as organizations, if it is so critical, why is it that so often we communicate so poorly? Why is it? Well, let's take a look at a few things this morning. The first reason why we communicate so poorly, we'll go over 3 of them this morning, is communication is so much more than language. Right? The assumption that we make is that because we can speak, we can communicate. When really nothing is further from the truth. If we speak, all we can do is really speak. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are communicating effectively with anyone that we're attempting to communicate with. So that is the first assumption that we make. Take a look here at a quote from a very famous psychologist, Abraham Maslow, who came up with what? The hierarchy of needs. Everyone remembers the pyramid, right? So Abraham Maslow says behavior in human beings is sometimes a defense, a way of concealing motives and thoughts, as language can be a way of hiding your thoughts, and what? Can you imagine this? Preventing communication, right? In other words, language, if it is inappropriately used, number one, it may not even be communication to begin with, but number 2, it can actually prevent communication from happening. Just because we know how to speak doesn't mean that we know how to what? How to communicate. Now, one way that this happens is when our words and our actions don't match. When we say something, which is the language, and then we do something, which is what? The tangible communication, and those 2 things don't match. If you want to see a relationship that's breaking down, if you want to see an organization that is dysfunctional, look for this incongruence between words and action. When they don't match, dysfunction usually follows, right? Because just speaking or just writing does not mean that we are actually communicating what we are intending to communicate, and many times those things don't match, and when they don't, we have not only the communication, not only the breakdown of communication, but we have the breakdown of trust, and we have the breakdown of confidence in each other. So the first thing is there, why we communicate so poorly? Well, because communication is so much more than just language. Number 2, because communication has less to do with speaking than it does with listening. That's worth repeating. Because communication has so much less to do with speaking than it actually has to do with listening. Here's a quote from a famous actress, Emma Thompson. I'm sure you've seen one of her films. Any problem, she writes, big or small, within a family always seems to start with bad communication. And here's where it gets interesting. Someone isn't listening. Someone isn't listening. I'll tell you what our challenge is. Our challenge is the fact that we see the world through our own eyes. Right? Our challenge is that we see the world through the filters that have been created in our own minds by our upbringing, by the people who have surrounded us for years and years and years. And because of that, because of these filters and these biases that we have, we see the world in a certain way, and we want to make sure that others perceive it our way. Because to admit that we're wrong many times is deeply hurtful, because many of us are convinced that we are actually quite right. And so here's what happens. We have these biases, we have these filters, we have these worldviews, we have these perspectives that are ours, and based on those perspectives, based on those biases, we make assumptions. We make assumptions. You know what Henry Winkler once said? The Fonz, remember the Fonz? Henry Winkler once said, I don't know why these actors are coming up with these great quotes, but here's one. He said, Assumptions are the termites of relationships. Assumptions are the termites of relationships. Right? So what we do is we take all of these biases that we have all of these filters. Number one, we don't see them as biases. We just see them as this is the way that we view the world, and, well, I believe it's the right way to view the world, but nevertheless, they're filters and they're biases. We take these things, and then when we begin to interact with each other, when we attempt to communicate with each other, at that point, we create assumptions based on those filters, and most of the time, we're wrong. Because we have not taken the time to do what? To listen for what another person's worldview is, or perspective is, or social upbringing is, in order to create a true dialogue. My brother and I, in college, we decided to take a road trip from Texas back to Chicago. I grew up in Chicago, which is why I don't have a native Texas accent. And so we decided to take a road trip back to Chicago to reconnect with some of our friends, and we stayed a little bit too long. And we had to get back for classes, and so coming down, we were driving just a little tiny bit over the speed limit, and we got pulled over. So this was sometime in the middle of the night. We were doing a nighttime drive, and we got pulled over, and 3 police officers came to our car. The big guy, and then 2 recruits. And you could tell that the big guy was putting on the show. In other words, he was going to teach these young bucks how to process 2 college kids driving at excessive speeds in the middle of the night. Now, here's a part of the story that I haven't told you. Before we went to Chicago, my parents gave me a call, and they said, listen, we have this favorite store up there where you can get these monstrous chunks of feta cheese, right? My parents love feta cheese, right? And so they weren't satisfied with buying the little cubes, at Central Market in Houston. They wanted the giant piece of feta cheese that they normally got from their little market in Chicago. And so they sent us with a little cooler. And they said, when you come back, just please go by that market, pick up this giant chunk of feta cheese, put it in, and just deliver it to us when you get back. Well, it's the least we could do, and so we picked up the feta cheese, and we were taking it back to Houston, where? In the back of our little red pickup truck. So in the back of a pickup truck is a cooler. When these police officers arrive, and they're shining flashlights and all of that good stuff, and they make us walk out of the car, and then finally the question comes, gentlemen, what is in the cooler? You can only imagine, right? 2 college kids driving at excessive speeds in the middle of the night with a cooler in the back of a pickup truck. Are you making any assumptions? Right? I said to the lead police officer, sir, it's cheese. Exactly, right? Yeah, right, it's cheese, right? I said, I promise you it's cheese. Now, I kind of knew what was going to happen because all 3 of them got around that cooler like this, right, with all their flashlights. They're practicing, sure. So they're looking at this cheese. Right, have you ever smelled feta cheese? Right, okay, so I knew. So I stepped back. I stepped back a little bit, and I remember this very day, kind of watching them over there, and all 3 of them were crowding around that cooler, and the lead officer opened up the cooler, and when that smell hit them, all 3 of them in concert went like this. Whoa. There was nothing in there but what? A giant chunk of feta cheese from Chicago. We do that all the time. We make assumptions based on the filters that we have, based on the biases that we have, and we say, this person must be wrong, or this person must think of life this way because it's the way that we are processing life. Now, why do we make these assumptions? In particular, why do we make these assumptions that make us so reactive? Right? So I know all of us have walked away from interactions that we've had saying, man, I can't believe I said that. Or I can't believe he said that, Or, man, that guy was defensive, right? All of us have walked away thinking these things. So why do we do that? Well, it takes a little brain science to let us know what's going on. We have, right in the middle of our brain somewhere, from what I can remember, a little part of our brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala deals with reactions. In particular, it deals with reactions to urgent matters. The amygdala in our brain is what deals with something that all of us have heard of called the flight or fight reaction, right? So here's what happens. If our amygdala is not kept in check, in other words, if it's not sort of one part of the brain rather than the part that's really like in charge, here's what the amygdala does. The amygdala begins to interpret everything around us as this is something that could be harmful to me. Maybe it's harmful to me because it'll ruin my reputation, because what somebody is saying is diametrically opposed to what I'm saying, and so I'm going to be what? I'm going to be defensive. I'm going to be argumentative. I'm going to even be aggressive. Why? Because this amygdala is saying this is harmful to you. Now, obviously, there are good things about the amygdala, right? If you're being chased by someone, the amygdala says run faster, and it even sends resources to help you run faster, right? But in human interaction, in interpersonal communication, if that amygdala isn't kept in check, guess what? We are reacting and overreacting to all sorts of things because we perceive them somehow to be harmful, so we either fight or we run, we avoid. And what we don't do is what? Communicate. We don't communicate effectively. And so we enter this reactive mode because something could be harmful to us. Tell you another little story. It happened at Thanksgiving time at our home, my folks' home there in Houston, Texas. And a lot of us were gathered around the big table, and my cousin-in-law was there as well with his family. And so in my parents' house, all the shoes, have to remain at the front door. And I'm sure some of you have homes like this, right? All the shoes are kind of gathered at the front door. Well, sometime during the meal, Lance, our younger son, who at that point in time was literally 2 years old, he decides that he's going to take a cup of water and somehow pour it into one of the shoes. Now, this is great fun for a 2-year-old, right? But what he didn't know is that he chose my cousin-in-law's shoes, and he's a man who always just wears very expensive shoes, I can't remember what brand they were, but I remember thinking, man, these are expensive shoes that are now essentially a drinking apparatus, right? So he poured this water in the man's shoe. Well, Roman, of course, comes and tells me, Lance did this, he's our older one, and I tell another family member tells another family member. Before long, by the way, my cousin-in-law knows nothing about this, before long the shoe ends up upstairs in the bathroom being blow-dried, right? Somebody is blow-drying his shoe. We've never told them this has happened, right? Somebody's blow-drying the shoe, making sure that all the water comes out, and then after the shoe is blow-dried, it is realized that if my cousin-in-law decides to put his shoes on for some reason and leave, he's going to realize that one shoe is about 95 degrees and the other one's a cool 75 degrees, and he's going to wonder what in the world is going on here. So what do they do next? They go and they put the shoe in the freezer, right? So the one, true story. So the one shoe is still at the front door, the other shoe is cooling in the freezer, and they're checking it every couple of minutes to make sure that it's about the same temperature as the other shoe. For Pete's sake, just tell the man that we spilled some water in your shoe. This is the reactive nature that many of us have a lot of the times when we are interacting. Why? Because part of our brain is telling us, fight or get out of here. Don't communicate, do something that is irrational. This is why many times we are irrational and we base our actions on our assumptions. Now, in the end, remember, we're still talking about the reason that we communicate poorly, take a look at it, is because it has less to do with speaking than listening and understanding the other. But in the end, it has a lot to do with the fact that we don't listen to ourselves. How many times do you ask yourself the why questions? Yourself. Why do I act this way? Why did I just mess up in that conversation? Why did I just do what I did, whether it's positive or negative? How many times do you actually listen to yourself? To ask yourselves questions of a personal nature where you and I are taking inventory of who we are as individuals. Right, so let's go to the next one. Number 3, we communicate because communication does not happen in a vacuum. Take a look at the quote. Every time we communicate, we are surrounded and influenced by a set of conditions that help determine why we did or did not interact in a particular way. In other words, sometimes the fact that we are good communicators is overshadowed by the fact that we are surrounded by poor communicators. So it doesn't matter how well we are communicating, the people around us are not communicating well. So what? Communication breaks down. You know, one of the best examples that we have of this is passive-aggressive communication. So you're surrounded by, or just let's say you're dealing with someone who tends to be a passive-aggressive communicator. That person will say to you, boy, it's cold in here. Now, what you don't know is what they actually mean. You know, do they mean, I want you to go and see if you can do something about the thermostat and the air conditioner, you know, turn up the AC a little bit, right? Do they mean, you know, if you see a jacket, can you bring me a jacket? Or do they simply mean, boy, it's cold in here, and I'm just making a statement of fact, right? So passive-aggressive communication is one of the types of communication that leads to frustration because we're not saying what is on our minds at all. I mean, another way that, another example that we can give is people who speak in terms of the other. Now, pastors, I know we know this very, very well, right? So a church member will come up to you and say, Pastor, some people are saying that. Right? Now, never mind that it's 1.5 people, and they said it once, right? But, you know, Pastor, you know, a group of people, you know, people are saying, you know, this or that. So we hide behind this other, this very passive-aggressive style of communication. We hide behind the other group, and it never comes out that the truth is quite opposite from that, because really, you know, who feels that way? I feel that way, right? If we were effective communicators, we would say, Pastor, I know you may not like this, but I'm going to take a risk here. I feel that X, Y, and Z. Boy, can you imagine if we were surrounded by people that? Imagine if we ourselves were able to step out of our passive-aggressive tendencies and begin to communicate tactfully yet clearly with other people, how much better it would be for us as communicators. Now, where are we? We are talking about the fact that we are poor communicators, number one, because good communication is so much more than language. Number two, it has less to do with speaking than with listening. Number three, it does not occur in a vacuum, because sometimes passive-aggressive communication exists. I'll give you an example from a film. A couple, the lead couple in this film, wakes up in the morning, and she says, boy, my mouth is dry. I'm thirsty. Right? Boy, my mouth is dry and I'm thirsty. What does he do? He jumps up out of bed, he goes to the kitchen without a word, comes back with a glass of water, and gives it to her. What does she do? She gets upset at him for bringing back a glass of water. And here are her words from the script directly. She says, you see, if I'm thirsty, I don't want a glass of water. I want you to sympathize. I want you to say, Gloria, I too know what it feels like to be thirsty. I too have had a dry mouth in the past. I want you to connect with me, she says, Gloria. I want you to connect with me through the concept of dry-mouthedness. Effective communication is difficult sometimes because it doesn't occur in a vacuum, because it involves other people who may not be good communicators, and sometimes we have to do what? Many times we have to read between the lines. And guess what? We're not so great at reading between the lines. Honey, I'm thirsty, but don't get me a glass of water. It is difficult sometimes because communication requires us to read between the lines. So all of it comes together to make the case that perhaps we communicate poorly because we don't have the right tools. We don't have the right understanding. Here's Abraham Maslow again. Take a look at the screen. If the only tool you have is a hammer, I'm sure you've seen this before, you tend to see every problem as a nail. So perhaps the reason is that we don't have tools. In the minutes that we have left, take a look at how we can communicate better. What can we do, should I say, to communicate better? Again, remember, these principles apply at different levels, interpersonally within our families, corporately, at the church level, at the organizational level, anywhere you are, these principles apply. How can we communicate better? Number one, we can communicate better by listening and observing. It's true. The breakdown of communication many, many times involves very little listening. Quick story. Famous chef, Marcus Samuelson, famous New York City chef, who was granted the right to cook for a state dinner recently at the White House. out of 40 well-known chefs throughout the nation, he was chosen to be the one after a long process of elimination. And listening to this interview with Samuelson, I think I actually have a picture of him, there he is. Listening to this interview with Samuelson, it dawned on me that the reason he got the contract is because he was the one who listened the best. As he was telling us how he got the contract, he said, listen, I realized that the Prime Minister of India was the guest of honor, so obviously there had to be some kind of a vegetarian menu. I also realized that at these state dinners, sometimes people don't know each other. It's the first time that they meet, so we're going to break bread. We're going to have a way for them to actually break bread, pass it to each other. It launches them to conversations. Number 3, he realized that the First Lady is really a huge proponent of health and healthy living. They have a garden at the White House now, and the obesity initiative and all of that, and he said, we're going to make this a very healthy meal. All of these things came together, and Marcus Samuelson got to cook for the Prime Minister of India, not to mention the President of the United States and the cabinet and everyone else. Why? Because he understood the concept of listening. My good friends, I think that the moment we realize that good communication begins not with a compelling argument, not with being the best in a debate class, but that good communication, and from good communication come good relationships and good organizational functionality and purposeful living and all that good. So from good communication, if we can begin to understand that it involves the ears more than the mouth, we will have taken a great step toward moving ahead in the direction that we need to move in and that we all want to move in. So that essentially takes us through that part of it. Now, let's talk then about some further tools and frameworks. So the first one is listening. There it is again, listening and observing. In fact, I want to introduce you to Miller's Law by a very well-known psychologist by the name of George Miller. Here's what he writes. Take a look. In order to understand what another person is saying, you must assume that it is true and try to imagine what it could be true of. In other words, for a moment, if you truly want to understand another person and to listen to that other person, for a moment, suspend your judgment, suspend the reaction to say, that's ridiculous, and say to yourself, no matter how ridiculous it sounds coming from this person, it is true, just for a moment. Because in that moment, we suspend our assumptions, we raise our filters, and for a moment we say the other person has a valid point. At that point in time, we begin to understand what his or her statement could be true of. It gives us a little bit more insight into who is speaking. Here's Miller's Law in reverse. I'm sure you've read it by now. In order to misunderstand a person, or in order to misunderstand what another person is saying, decide that it's false. The second you hear it, decide that it's false. Decide to yourself, oh no, that's way too liberal. Oh no, that's way too conservative. Oh no, that is way outside of the realm of what I consider to be true. If you want to misunderstand a person, Miller says, decide that it's false, then try to imagine what's wrong with the person who said it that would account for this unacceptable speech. Miller's Law. Here's another way to think about it. We spend 50% of our time on average listening. In other words, because we have to. We spend 50% of our time listening. The question is, do we really know how to listen? Do we really know how to listen? In other words, do we know how to suspend our own judgments and truly listen to the other person so that we could have a dialogue? That is a challenge for all of us. But it is one way that we can begin to communicate better. Number 2, take a look what we can do to communicate better. Understanding the other. Understanding the other. Now, we've already kind of broached this topic, but I want to reiterate a concept that I think all of you have heard about, and that is the love languages that are introduced by Dr. Gary Chapman, the 5 love languages. They are a profound concept because they allow us to begin to understand that every single one of us are wired a little bit differently. In fact, some of us are wired very differently. And so what Gary Chapman says is that based on these love languages, we all receive and give love and appreciation and all of these things in different ways. And so if we truly want to understand the other, we would understand not how we like to receive and give love, but primarily how they like to understand or process and receive love, and so on and so forth. It is a paradigm that we can very, very much apply to interpersonal communication. In other words, begin to truly understand the other. In fact, a good exercise is right now begin to think of a person, pardon me, begin to think of a person who you are at odds with. And begin to ask yourself the question, have I truly ever given that person a fair chance in my own mind? Have I truly ever tried to imagine what it's like to walk in his or her shoes? I mean, nobody's judging you. It's just you in your own mind. And I'm sure that if we're honest with ourselves, we can say, you know, in the end, I've done more speaking than listening. In the end, I've tried to convince him or her about something where I believe that he or she is absolutely wrong, rather than sitting down for a moment, suspending my own judgment, and beginning to understand how that person is wired, and why they're wired that way, and why they're so convinced that they are right. So then, understanding each other is the second thing, and giving each other room. Number 3, we only have 4 of them. Number 3, create safe environments. Do you realize that most of us refuse to communicate because we are afraid? Remember that amygdala says to you, I really can't tell my supervisor how I feel because I am afraid. I am afraid of, well, at most, losing my job. But second of all, I am afraid that the next time my boss or my supervisor sees me, they're going to act weird around me. Right? Or when it comes time to form a committee, they're going to remember that I said something that was at odds with whoever it was, right? And so we keep ourselves from communicating because we are afraid to communicate. Why? Because we have not created safe environments for communication. Husbands and wives, have you created safe environments in your homes for each of you to communicate openly and honestly and transparently? Or have you jumped to conclusions or made judgments based on your assumptions? Have you interrupted your partner right in the middle of speaking because you felt angry or defensive or wronged rather than just listening? In other words, have we created safe environments in our homes? Have we created safe environments within our local churches? Have we created safe environments within our conference so that we won't have to be afraid to communicate, to share with each other what's truly on our hearts, rather than doing all of these little dances around all of these little bushes, afraid of what the repercussions may be? How much time gets wasted when we don't just simply communicate openly and honestly with each other? So one way to do this is number 1, be aware of brain science. I mean, God created us in a very specific way. Our brains function the way they do for a reason, but sometimes one part of the brain, like I mentioned earlier, can begin to think too much of itself. So begin to be aware of the fact that your amygdala's primary job is to warn you of danger, but not everything is danger. So notch it down a bit, right? We begin to notch it down a bit. We begin not to create a worst-case scenario that allows us to either fight or flee. The second way to create safe environments is not to use polarized language, right? So when somebody says, you always, or you never, what reaction does that elicit inside of you? I mean, you know yourself better than anyone else knows you, and you know that it's not always, right? In fact, most of us are starting to come up with percentages, right? Well, you know, it may be 50%, I'll give you 60%, but I'm sure it's only 40%. I mean, in our heads we do these dances because when somebody says, you never take out the trash, immediately we think to ourselves, well, you know, last week I did once, you know, and a couple of weeks ago it dawned on me, and late at night I took out the trash. I mean, you know, we justify all these things because of the polarized language. Now imagine if we did away with the polarized language. Because even the polarized language comes out of fear and insecurity. right? Imagine if we did away with the polarized language and we begin to say what we feel in these terms. Imagine if I came up to you and I said, you know, part of me is really angry at you. Part of me is really angry at you because sometimes I see you doing things that are hurtful to me. Right? In other words, we remove the polarized language out of it, we notch down the intensity factor a little bit, and we begin to say what we truly are feeling, and that is that part of me is angry with you, part of me loves you. Part of me can't wait till we go out to lunch tomorrow. But today, part of me is angry with you and frustrated. Now that's a lot more sensible. That's a lot easier to deal with in interpersonal communication. So if we want to begin to create safe environments, begin to remove the polarized language, the always and the never, and other things like that. All right, and then finally, let's look at the very last one. How can we, what can we do to communicate better? Increase your vocabulary. Now you may have never imagined that this bullet would have been on this slide. Increase your vocabulary, and what that means is this. The better we're able to use our words to communicate, the more effective we are at communicating what's deep down inside of us. I'll give you the best case scenario. When our kids were not speaking yet, mostly Leah, taught them baby sign. Right? How many of you have heard of baby sign? Well, baby sign is a way for you to teach your kids how to use their hands to sign to you what they want. So if they want milk, or if they want food, or if they are hurting, or something of that nature, you teach them how to do this. And so we did, and I can tell you that we saved, yes, I see some of you still remembering the baby sign language. What happened was that we saved ourselves dozens and dozens and dozens of temper tantrums because our kids, before they knew how to say dada or mama, knew how to tell us, I am hungry, or I am thirsty, with very simple hand signs. Do you know what happens when we increase our vocabulary? We reduce our frustration because we can communicate in more compelling ways. And we can communicate in ways that are clear, and we don't have to revert to words and or phrases that are ambiguous, which make us uncomfortable because we know that the other person isn't getting what we're saying, and so we become even more frustrated, and that leads to anger, and the communication breakdown occurs. Begin to literally increase your vocabulary. Now, that can be taken ideologically as well. If we're dealing with organizations and people who are diametrically opposed to us ideologically, begin to broaden your horizons. Begin to learn more about who they are. Begin to learn more about the world in which you live. Because once we have that increased vocabulary, we can begin to talk to each other in intelligent ways, and that reduces the frustration. I have heard Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak on a number of occasions on the internet and on television. And let me tell you the one thing that grabs me again and again and again, not only with his scripted sermons and messages, but in interviews where he was literally talking off the cuff. Dr. Martin Luther King was a master of his vocabulary. And because of that, because he had the grasp on language, he was able to create compelling arguments that, when matched with his actions, made him an unstoppable force. Last way to increase our communication skills is to increase our vocabulary. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have really only scratched the surface here, and I thank you for your time and for your attention, and I want to challenge you that as we leave here today, not to just sort of go on to the next thing, but to make a commitment today to continue learning about yourself, to continue learning about the other, to continue learning about your spouse, to continue learning about your church members and your leaders and your fellow pastors, to learn about yourself and the world in which you live so that together we can become better